The military in space is certainly a topic which divides opinion, but one thing you can't deny is that militaries around the world have brought in billions of dollars of investment into spaceflight.
So today, we're talking to expert Dwayne Day to find out more.
Let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do this via our social media pages at Space and Things Podcast on Threads, Instagram, and Facebook, via the contact form on our website, or by leaving a review on your podcast platform.
And please consider joining us at patreon.com/Space and Things. But right now, it's time for episode 194 of the Space and Things podcast.
Oh my God. Unbelievable, but it is right this time.
You're listening to the Space and Things podcast with Emily Carney and Dave Giles.
I'm Emily Carney.
And I'm Dave Giles, and welcome to our podcast. How you doing, Emily?
I'm doing great. I'm working on a few things that y'all will see in upcoming months. I've been working on that this week. How are you doing, Dave?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. Thanks. Off on tour in a couple of weeks. Just a small little thing. So getting prepped for that, which is fun. And also beginning to plan our episode 200, which is just round the corner.
Yes, and we're going to have some amazing guests.
Yeah, those people who are on our Patreon already have found out.
Yes.
If you want to know more about that, head over to Patreon. But right, let's move on to this week's main feature. Emily and I like to have a little brainstorm every now and then about what we haven't covered yet. After nearly 200 shows, you'd think that we'd have run out of things, but far from it. Emily pointed out that we've never touched on the subject of military space and reconnaissance satellites. While it's a subject we have certainly touched on within news stories and as part of other topics, it's never been the main focus, and it's a pretty big part of the story of spaceflight. Fortunately, Emily knows today's guest, Dwayne Day, who knows a lot about this subject.
Dwayne Day is a senior program officer at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, where he serves as a study director for studies on NASA space science and aeronautics subjects. He also worked as an investigator for the Columbia Accident Investigation Board and is a historian and policy analyst. In his spare time, he also writes civil and military space history on subjects from Apollo to the Space Shuttle, but has written extensively on the history of American satellite reconnaissance.
Right, let's get started.
Let's light this candle. It's time to crack on.
So, hello, Dwayne. Thank you for joining us this week. So let's start by discussing the origin of reconnaissance satellites. So what factors dictated the need for these assets, and what were the first satellites like technologically?
So I would actually go farther back than just the dawn of satellite reconnaissance. And ever since the beginning of warfare, which probably started when we were still swinging from the trees, the basic idea of going to higher ground to see farther and to see where your enemy was, it was just a natural inclination. And so if you go back into history with battles of large armies, somebody would climb a tree or somebody would go up to a higher hill to look out and assess the enemy. And it wasn't until really the 1800s where there was the application of new technology to try and see farther and to see better. And that was with balloons. And in fact, the United States developed balloons during the Civil War, where they would go up in a balloon every morning to look out and see if they could detect the Confederate Army. The distance that they could actually see from the balloon was about the distance that an army could march in a day. So they went up in the morning and they determined, okay, there was no army there, so they had another safe day that the Confederates were not marching on Washington. Once you get into World War I, there was new technology that was being employed, and that was in the form of pigeons initially. There was an effort to put cameras on pigeons and fly them over enemy lines, and the cameras were on an automatic timer, and they would snap away pictures.
Wow.
Hopefully the pigeon would come back to your side, and you develop the film and see if that told you anything about the enemy's deployment. Pigeons not very reliable. And quickly airplanes came along, and airplanes were then employed for reconnaissance. That became the standard going into World War II, for instance, where the planes would be equipped with multiple cameras, and they would fly out over enemy lines, usually by themselves, without much protection. And the idea was to sneak in and take pictures before the enemy could actually detect you and intercept you. By the end of the war, there was this new technology that had been employed, which was the ballistic missile. And it was becoming clear that we were going to be able to send things into space sometime in the next few decades using ballistic missiles. And so the Army Air Forces, they commissioned a study from Douglas Aircraft Corporation. And Douglas had a special division called initially Research and Development. And they produced a study about an experimental world-circling spacecraft. And this would be atomic-powered, and it would have a TV camera on it. This study came out in 1946, and that division of Douglas became the Rand Corporation. And then for the next several years into the 1950s, the U.S. Air Force commissioned more studies from the Rand Corporation to look into the development of a reconnaissance capability from space. There was some initial funding for this from the Air Force in the mid-1950s. It was very underfunded, and it was going to be a very expensive program. And it really wasn't until Sputnik in 1957 that this all got kicked into high gear. And there were multiple programs that were funded immediately after Sputnik. And the very first one that was successful was named Corona. And the way Corona worked was it actually had a film camera on it. And it would expose strips of film, place them into a recoverable capsule, and that capsule would be ejected from orbit, come back through the atmosphere, and it would be recovered. That film would be processed on the ground, and then people in dark offices in Washington would look at the exposed film and see what it revealed. And the first successful system was in mid-1960.
How did these programs evolve as photographic technology improved and it became possible to employ digital photography versus the film canisters that got ejected?
So I think today, very few people have knowledge of film, or very few people use film. You have to be an old timer like me to have actually once used a film camera, gone through all the hassle, which was you take a picture and then you don't actually know what it looks like for quite a while until you get it developed. We tend to look at film technology as if it's ancient technology, as if it's rather crude, and we all have a digital camera and our cell phone and that. But it turns out that film was actually a very powerful way of storing data. You can store a tremendous amount of imagery data on that very thin piece of film, and then when you enlarge it and you enhance it, you can extract that data in different ways. And so these early film cameras, which were for reconnaissance, satellite reconnaissance, which were developed in the late 1950s and perfected throughout the 1960s, they stayed in use through the 60s, the 70s, even into the 80s. And the Soviet Union continued to use them for quite a while longer than that because of these inherent characteristics of both the quality and the amount of data that could be contained. In the mid-1970s, the United States launched its first digital system, which was called the KH-11 or the Kennen system. The Kennen is actually an old English word. It's also a German word. It means to know. So the satellite, it was a hint at its actual intelligence mission. And Kennen had a very large mirror on it. It was the size of the Hubble Space Telescope mirror. And in fact, they were made by the same companies. And Kennen was the first system that could take an image, relay it through another satellite down to a ground station outside of Washington, and then that image could be developed, could be looked at within about an hour of when it was taken. And that digital image could be stored, it could also be manipulated, and that created a new dynamic because throughout the 60s and the 70s, the early 70s, the way these images were used was to kind of give an assessment of what are the capabilities, how many tanks and missiles and bombers and submarines are in the Soviet Union. They were a way of counting things and then measuring things. But it was very much almost a retrospective use, that it told us what they had done up until now, and then we could project a little bit of what are their capabilities for the future. But that was kind of inherent in the system, because you took a picture and then you had to wait for it to come back and wait for it to be developed. It was not instantaneous. Once you had a near instantaneous capability, it gave you new kinds of opportunities that you could look at things that were happening on the ground right now and make assessments about them. And it wasn't just really big things like, where is the army and is it about to invade Western Europe or things like that, but you could actually look at, say, if there was a coup in a foreign country, you could use your satellite to look at, say, the presidential palace and see if the what forces were deployed around that palace. And that could give you an idea of whether or not the leader had been overthrown or whether they still had defensive forces and they were holed up resisting the rebel forces and things like that. So satellite reconnaissance by the late 70s into the 80s, at least for the United States, became this kind of warning and prediction and real-time asset that gave you a lot more capability than the film systems had. It really was another revolution in intelligence at that time. Now, those systems, they did have some drawbacks. They were very expensive. The storage was really difficult. Today, we have almost unlimited storage. When you take a picture, you can just keep taking pictures and you can manipulate them really easily. You can rotate a picture, you can enhance it. The computer technology through the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, it often choked on some of these images. It was really difficult to do simple things like comparing two pictures to look for differences. And so the computer technology was always trying to catch up with the capabilities that were being deployed with these new systems.
Okay, we've had a message from Don Irwin, who is one of our Patreon subscribers, which is relevant here, particularly with regards to the Corona system. He says, how flexible were the satellites during a mission? How far ahead did mission targets need to be laid out? And in my own head, I started asking similar questions when you talked about being able to check on a presidential palace during a coup. I was wondering how many satellites had to be up there to make sure that things could be viewed instantly, or did they have a good way of mobilizing a fleet of satellites to certain areas?
So there's several parts to that question. The answer depends in part on when we are talking about. So if we're talking about the 1960s, and the two reconnaissance systems that the United States operated in the 60s were the Corona system and the Gambit system. And Corona was an area search system. It had a camera that swept back and forth, actually had two of them. They swept back and forth and they covered a tremendous amount of territory in each image. And the satellite would fly north to south, coming over the Soviet Union, and these cameras would sweep back and forth, and they'd gather up a lot of imagery of what was below the satellite. But it was relatively low resolution. And so what you could do is you could, say, photograph an airfield and then count the aircraft there and maybe determine their type, but you couldn't tell fine details. But that was a good way of determining whether the Soviet airfield had a lot of bombers on it or the bombers had been dispersed to other airfields, that kind of thing. Gambit took photographs of a much smaller area, but at very high resolution. And so you could see a lot of details in there. You could tell the difference between two different kinds of fighter planes sitting next to each other on an airfield. As to the question of how flexible they were, the Corona was really kind of like a wind-up clock. You set the programming before you launched it, and then it just operated when it got over the Soviet Union. The cameras turned on, then the cameras turned off after it made its pass. You could do a few adjustments. For instance, if you had indications that there were clouds over a target, you would just send up an order to the satellite and say, don't take pictures during this period because they're just going to be a waste of film. But it was very limited in that kind of dynamic tasking, I guess you might want to call it. Gambit had a lot more capability in that you could reprogram it on the fly. You could tell it, okay, take a picture of this target, but not this other target. Take a picture of these three targets and ignore the other ones. And when Gambit was in its prime, really in the 1970s, a single satellite was able to take something like 15,000 photographs. Now, this is all on film, so starting and stopping this film throughout the mission. as far as how many of these things were operating, generally in the 60s, they launched about one Corona satellite a month and one Gambit satellite a month. And then that number kind of started to go down as the satellites were able to last a little longer. And so you'd launch a satellite, a Corona, for instance, you would take photographs for a couple of days and then return that film. And then you'd turn it off for about a week or two, and you'd take some more photographs, and then you'd bring that film down. So you're getting a limited number of images over the course of a month, and then you're processing them. But you're not getting immediate reconnaissance capability. Everything that you're looking at happened a few days earlier at best, sometimes a week or more earlier. Once the Cannon entered service in 1976, and eventually they added a second one I think it was about 18 months later, the satellites were overhead, and then your limitation was just where was it in its orbit, but it was up there all the time. It could take pictures if the relay satellite was in the right position and if the satellite was working properly. And so you could get images every single day. There wasn't much of a limit to how many pictures you could get other than, say, the total bandwidth. But at any given time, there were no more than a handful of these satellites in orbit. And that was true in the 80s and into the 90s and the 2000s. What's really changed in the past 10 years or so is there's the dawn of commercial imagery. We had commercial imagery satellites going back into the 1980s and the 1990s, but there were very few of them. They were restricted. They were licensed. For instance, the U.S. government had to license an American satellite and could determine how good the resolution was, could determine what it could look at, and could determine what images could be released to the public. But really in the last 10, 15 years or so, we've had a lot more companies with smaller satellites, and a lot more of these satellites go into orbit. And now we have companies like Planet and Airbus, and they have multiple satellites in orbit. The images they take are lower quality, but there's so many satellites that they're kind of covering the globe all the time. And so as long as there's no clouds below, your ability to get images is tremendously increased, where you could just say, okay, I want a picture of the Middle East from this morning. And you can order that with a credit card, really. You could just go online and say, I want a picture of this. And there's probably going to be a satellite that will be in that area and able to take a photograph. And you may have that image within a day or even less. Now, the quality is going to be much lower than what the military satellites are capable of, but those are all classified and we don't get access to them. But it has really revolutionized, again, this kind of immediacy of the data. And one of the things that we've seen in the last few years, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is there are private citizens who they hear about something happening in Ukraine, and then they go online and they order a satellite photo, and within a day, they may have a satellite photo that shows that the Ukrainians attacked a Russian shipyard, or that Russian forces have moved into a new town or something like that. And that's private citizens who are accessing that information, when previously it was only governments with multi-billion-dollar budgets and high security clearances that could do that kind of thing.
Does that pose a threat to us, that we've all got access to that, or is that a good thing? What's your view on that?
That is actually a very tough question. I mean, that's a really good question. Is in some cases, it could really be a threat. There are examples really from the recent past where people have gotten concerned that, for instance, foreign actors are using commercially available imagery to look at our own facilities, for instance. If you are interested in, say, engaging in a terrorist act against American forces, and you want to know where those forces are deployed, is it possible that you could go buy a satellite image that reveals that information? There are supposed to be safeguards on that, but of course, if you have the ability to mask yourself over the internet and mask your identity, then you can evade some of those protections. But that is certainly an issue. That is certainly something that people worry about, that governments worry about. There are restrictions to certain kinds of imagery. If you go onto one of these commercial sites that's licensed from the United States, you cannot order up images of parts of Israel, for example, because that's blocked through the licensing agreement with these companies. There are restrictions with the resolution, for example. Back in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a lot of obsession with this area in Nevada, the Nevada desert, Area 51, supposedly where, according to the conspiracy theorists, that's where the government has kept UFOs. But, we know from history that that's where the U-2 spy plane was developed, and the SR-71, the predecessor to the SR-71, was developed out there. And up through the 90s, we only had a few satellite images of that location, which is a big airfield out in the desert. Now you can actually go online and order a photograph of that area, and I don't think there are any real restrictions on that. Now, I am sure that the people who work out there are very annoyed with that because, of course, it forces restrictions on them. If they know that there are satellites overhead, they can't roll out their top secret aircraft. And now there are a lot of satellites overhead. So they're constantly having to hide. It's not just that they have to hide from the occasional Soviet satellite that was flying overhead during the 70s and 80s. Now the stuff is up there all the time. But you as a private citizen can go get a picture, and there's no restriction on that. But the government has to face this new reality.
Excuse me for being a little bit cynical here, but in some ways they've brought that on themselves by doing reconnaissance of other countries anyway. Like, is it not like if one country can look at everyone else, surely they have to accept that other people want to have a look at them as well?
Well, the genie is out of the bottle, and it has been out of the bottle for quite a while. The United States developed satellite reconnaissance in the late 50s, early 60s. The Soviet Union was not, was only a few years behind. It took other countries until the 70s and 80s to start to develop their own capability. But the technology was out there and was available. It was expensive, but really, once we got into this, into the 2000s, there was no way to prevent it from proliferating to other countries, including ones that we are not friendly with at all. North Korea and Iran are both trying to develop a satellite reconnaissance capability because nobody else is sharing images with them. I wouldn't agree that we brought it on ourselves. I think that, it's like a lot of technologies that eventually they proliferate, they spread, they become common knowledge, and there's nothing you can do really to prevent that. You just have to deal with it.
I guess I was more just trying to point out that you can't be too angry about it. That's just how things work, isn't it? Like once technology exists and it starts proliferating, you can't really be angry about the fact that other people are getting it, can you? You just have to adapt.
It's the modern age. People can be angry about anything, right?
Yeah.
And they quite often are. I think within the United States, within the intelligence community, for a long time, they had exclusive access to this capability, to this technology. And it was very highly valued. So here's one of my pet peeves, which is if you go into a bookstore, and we still have bookstores, if you go into a bookstore and you go to, say, the espionage section of a bookstore, you're going to find several shelves of books, and they're all about spies. They're all about, Aldrich James and James Hansen and Tolkachev and various spies throughout history. What you will not find are books about satellite reconnaissance or submarine intelligence collection or technical intelligence collection, grabbing signals out of the air using antennas and sophisticated processing systems. You're not going to find much on that. And yet, throughout the history of the Cold War and later intelligence collection, at least for the United States, the vast majority of the intelligence that we have collected has come from these technical systems, particularly satellites. And there are a few documents that have been declassified over the years that have admitted that, where, they say something like 80% of the intelligence that we collect this was in the mid 1970s, it comes from satellites. But you're not going to find that reported. You're not going to find that written. You're not going to find a lot of books about that, and you're not going to find a lot of people who have talked about that. It's all the James Bond stuff that gets the attention. There's a reason for some of that, which is that because this was such an important source of intelligence, the US government put up these classification restrictions around what they were doing. They made everything top secret code word access so that very few people could get access to the technical details of how the systems worked and what information they were gathering and all of that. It created a culture there, this exclusive club of people who had access, who knew how important the information was, and who valued it very highly. And now some of those people, they look at the current world and the situation where anybody with a credit card can order a satellite photo of Area 51 and look for the top secret planes in the hangars. And they look at that and they're really annoyed. They don't like that. But, that's like shouting at the clouds. That's the world that we live in, right? That doesn't mean that they don't try in some cases to restrict certain access. Like I mentioned, the photographs of Israel. But there are a lot of companies, not simply American companies, that have these capabilities. In fact, one of the ironies of all this is that the US government has restricted American companies from developing certain capabilities commercially, only to see another country develop those capabilities. And so if you wanted, for instance, to buy synthetic aperture radar images taken by a satellite, for a while, you could not get that from a US company. You went and you ordered it from a foreign company. And there's a double-edged sword problem there, which is that you have then prevented an American company from advancing its capabilities that could be used by the US government. And you've built up somebody else's capabilities by restricting access.
So this is kind of a slight change of pace, but has a reconnaissance satellite ever been utilized to image another spacecraft? And why? And is this something that's frequently done, or is it something that is really not done very often?
Yeah, so I know that one of your favorite subjects, Emily, is Skylab. And that is actually one of the first known examples within the U.S. of where a satellite was used to image another satellite. Going back to the early 1970s, and we had previously discussed the Gambit satellite, which was a high resolution system, which was used for things like measuring the size of Soviet weapon systems on the ground. In the early 1970s, some people in the Air Force out in Los Angeles Air Force Base, where they managed the Gambit program, they developed the capability to point Gambit at other satellites. And that wasn't an easy thing to do because, you have this different relative motion. The two satellites are in different orbits. They're moving at very high velocity around the Earth. And so you have to move your camera in order to track the other satellite as you're taking your photograph. So they developed that capability to photograph Soviet satellites. And we don't know very much about who developed this and why they developed it, but that capability existed in the early 1970s. And then when Skylab was launched, very quickly in the launch, something went wrong. And when Skylab reached orbit, it was a crippled spacecraft. And we had a lot of telemetry that came down and it showed, well, this thing is broken and we got no data from this other system. And so NASA had an idea of what was busted on Skylab in orbit, but they didn't have a good assessment of what that really meant. And so the National Reconnaissance Office came along and said, you know what, we can take a photograph of Skylab, and that'll give you a good idea of what's going on there. And so they retasked a satellite, a Gambit, and they pointed it at Skylab. They took a photograph. They brought the exposed film back to Earth. They actually ended the mission early in order to do that, which had a cost. You bring that film back early, it means that you're not taking photographs of the Soviet Union for the rest of that mission. But they deemed that the Skylab program was a national program. This is American property, and we need to do everything we can to save this mission. And so they developed the photograph, and they were able to make an assessment of what had broken on Skylab. So that was in 1973. But once again, that was a film system. So every time you take the picture, you're not taking a picture of something else. Then when Canon came along in 1976, it really opened up the possibilities here because you know, like a digital camera, you could take however many pictures you want to take. And when the Columbia mission, STS-1, occurred in 1981, they had prepared to actually use a Canon satellite to image Columbia in orbit because there was this concern that the tiles, the heat protective tiles on Columbia might fall off during launch. And there was no way to know if that had happened other than you did some kind of examination of the spacecraft in orbit. And so that was all set up ahead of time. And Columbia was launched and it pointed itself in a certain direction. It aimed itself at the satellite, and the Canon took a picture and all that stuff. We don't know the details of that. We just know that it happened. We don't know what it revealed. This is still one of the most classified aspects of American intelligence gathering that we know happens, but we don't know any of the details. So that happened for STS-1. We don't know if it happened on any of the following shuttle missions. We do know that at some point they stopped doing it because it took a lot of coordination and a lot of effort in order to take these photographs. They stopped doing it. And then when Columbia was launched in 2003, and there was the concern about the foam hitting the underside of the orbiter, there were people in NASA who thought, well, hey, maybe we should try to get photographs of this thing in orbit. And maybe there are assets. They didn't know what they were. They didn't know if it was, there were telescopes on the ground that you can point up and look at a satellite, but they were also thinking maybe there's things in orbit that can take pictures of Columbia. So there are people who started to talk about that, and then that very quickly got shut down within NASA, and no photographs were taken. So there's a long history of this, that the capability existed, and then they stopped using it. So that is on the classified side. In recent years, that capability has now migrated to the commercial side. And if you go online, you can find images that have been taken of other satellites in orbit. Still, it's a relatively recent capability to become available commercially, and I don't know what the restrictions are. To date, I have seen photographs that have been taken of, say, the International Space Station and some pieces of space junk, things like that, but nobody has come out with a photograph of, say, another classified satellite in orbit yet. And I'm assuming that there are rules that do not allow that, but that is another capability that's just proliferated. We may be able to restrict it commercially, but China is almost certainly taking pictures of our satellites, and Russia is taking pictures of our satellites. They're just not making them available.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're also taking photos of their satellites as well. So we had a question from Bruce McCandless III, and he's wondering if it's possible to know exactly how much money gets spent by the US government on military activity in space compared to the NASA budget, for example. He says that we know that the Space Force budget is roughly $4 billion larger than the NASA budget, but there's obviously a lot of other military assets and spending in space.
That's actually a really good question. And to be honest, I don't know a precise answer to this. So I think that it is possible to figure out how much money is being spent. I don't know how to do it.
Right.
What I have been told, and it's not an area that I've delved into myself, but what I've been told is if you look at the entire Department of Defense budget, the whole budget number is known. You can look at all of the lines in there for, how much goes to the Navy and how much to the Air Force and how much to the Army and the Marines. And somewhere buried in that budget, you can figure out what is going to the National Reconnaissance Office. Right. It is there. It's not identified as such. There's no NRO, line number, but it's somehow public. It's just not easily understood. Now, I don't know if that's still true. I was told that many years ago, and there are better things to do in my life than to pour through budget numbers in a, whatever the DoD budget is now, $800 billion, something like that. I'm a policy wonk and a geek, but I am not that much of a policy wonk and a geek. when it comes to budget figures.
Yeah. Okay. So the answer, Bruce, is go look for yourself. He did say that it's obviously difficult to figure out what's going on the Pentagon funding, but he did wonder whether it was possible, and that was been answered.
My guess is it's probably on the same order as Space Force or NASA. So it's not twice as big. It's probably in the same ballpark. I think the interesting question would be, okay, where is all that money going, though? If you knew that top line money figure, if you knew it was, say, 24 billion, where's it all being spent? Because you can figure it out for NASA. You can count the number of launches. You can look at the various field centers and all that. I think it would be a lot harder to figure that out for a classified intelligence budget because, for one thing, they're not launching all that much.
Yeah.
If they're only launching a few times a year, where is all the money going? And I don't know that. That's an interesting question. One of the things that you learn over time when you look at the space budgets, we can all count rockets and we can count spacecraft and we can count people. Try and figure out how much we spend on software. Software is a really expensive part of any advanced program, particularly an advanced military program. And there's a lot of money that goes into software. So I think that even knowing that number would limit our ability to understand it.
Yeah, for sure. Right, we've got one more question. As some people may have guessed from the tone of my voice, some people like myself are uncomfortable with the idea of military in space. It goes against the ideals of what I consider to be noble about spaceflight. So when we see so much money is spent on military needs in space compared to science or exploration, it's a tough pill to swallow. Is there an obvious counter-argument to people like me who say such things?
I could give you the snarky counter argument, which is that, welcome to the world we live in.
Yeah.
This is the way things are. But I think I'd go beyond that, which is if we did not have these military programs, we wouldn't have civil programs. If you go back to, where did the initial studies of putting things into orbit come from? It was done for military purposes. Where did the first American who went into orbit? He was launched on top of a converted ICBM, the Atlas missile. The military funded a lot of that initial propulsion development and satellite development and capabilities. NASA then was created in 1958, and for a while, the NASA budget was significantly larger than the military space budget. And that was because putting humans into space is really expensive. You have to do a lot of things to keep them alive, and you don't need to do all that if you have a robotic spacecraft. But there was a lot of technology development that came out of the military side that enabled the civil program to exist. Also, if you go back to the initial development of the civilian space program, people like Eisenhower and Kennedy, they did not support it because they had romantic ideals of humanity traveling in space, and they didn't have these kind of noble pursuits in mind. It was a lot more complex than that. We funded NASA in order to beat the Russians in a public competition. And they were thinking in terms of geopolitics and an adversary and competition and all of those things. They were not thinking about space settlements. And to the extent that they were thinking about spreading or enhancing democracy, it was related to the world situation that we were faced with at that time. If that had not existed, I think that we would have had a civil space program a lot later than we actually did.
Well, thank you so much, Dwayne. This has been wonderful, and hopefully we'll speak to you again.
Thank you.
Splashing down after a fiery re-entry, this is Space and Things.
This was a fascinating conversation. I really had no idea that balloons and pigeons were being used during the Civil War and World War I. and things like that. It makes sense that aircraft were later used once aircraft became really good. But it makes sense that balloons and pigeons were being used as well, because it makes sense that the enemy would want to use some kind of aerial assets to, sort of watch, keep tabs on each other, I suppose. I just think that's fascinating. That the history behind it is really fascinating. And it didn't really occur to me that, wow, yeah, they could use things like that to sort of keep tabs on each other. And it's also really interesting for me to sort of see it as Dwayne sketched out the evolution of reconnaissance satellites. Obviously in the beginning, it was all film. It had to be ejected in a canister back to Earth. They had to develop it. Those of you who are a certain age, like me, you remember taking the film to Kmart back in the day, and it took a few days to develop it. If you spent more money, they could do it in one day. And I was broke, so I was not doing it in one day. My point being is that, back in the earlier days, they were using, film, because that's all they really had. And then once they developed digital, you could do real-time reconnaissance. You could monitor a situation almost instantaneously. And those photos could be, sent and manipulated and things like that. I mean, it's just really fascinating to me to see, sort of the history and evolution of that kind of technology. For those who have an interest, this is a great book. I think a lot of you have read it. Dave, I'm pretty sure you've read this book. This book is not by Dwayne Day. Dwayne has written a book on satellite reconnaissance that is excellent, but there's also a book called Into the Black by Roland White, which discusses the effort to discusses the early shuttle program, but it also discusses the effort to image Columbia after its launch. And it's really a cool story. And to my knowledge, it wasn't really talked about a lot before that book came out. And obviously, some of the things that are involved with that effort are still classified. The photos are classified. They've never been released or anything like that. So if you're interested in that, that's an amazing book. And of course, Dwayne's work as well. He's really the expert in this area. And I love reading his stories. I am not an expert in that area. So if I have a question about it, that's the person I go to.
Yeah, what was fun with that interview is that we had about 4 other questions written down, which we didn't have to ask because Dwayne answered them.
Yeah.
It's always fun for us when that happens. His knowledge is wonderful, and he constructed his answers in a way that he gave us exactly what we wanted, which was nice. I do find this whole subject to be hard, personally.
Yeah,
but
I understand.
That's me, and it'd be interesting to hear what our listeners think about this. It's another one of those subjects again where when you're not American is very interesting, because you guys have a very interesting viewpoint about your place in the world, and it's weird to hear it.
I can understand it. I think I'm a little desensitized to it because, number one, I am American, and number two, I was in the military.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think my viewpoint on this is a little different from others. So maybe I'm not the right person to ask. I'm a little biased. Maybe I'm not the right person to discuss that. You know what I'm saying? Like, I try to look outside myself, and I look at your concerns, and those are valid. Those are valid concerns, but I still have that internal bias that's like, well, I get it, but at the same time, I know I have it, and I'm aware there's something in me that's going to make my viewpoint a lot different. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fun thing from an outside perspective is one of the big words that America love to use is freedom.
Mm-hmm.
The country is about freedom.
Yeah.
And yet they survey everything. And actually, you have very little freedom. You think you do, but actually everything can be observed from multiple angles.
Yeah, I'm not disputing that. I almost had a snarky comment to make about people in general. I notice the people on social media who are like, I love everybody. I think opportunities should be open for all. And then they're the ones spying on people the most. Like, they're the ones that are like stalking everybody's profiles to find picture they didn't like from 2010 or something like that. A picture of somebody in a bikini. I don't know. But my point is, there's definitely that yin and yang there of like, yeah, we believe in this. and then on the side, people are doing something else.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm saying? Yeah, I see what you're saying. That's definitely a thing.
Yeah, but equally, I completely appreciate that Dwayne's snarky comment to me as well. This is the way of the world, and I agree, it is the way of the world. And I just think if we're opening up the door for one person to be able to view an image, then in my opinion, everyone should be able to view it. There are images of everything. Well, let's not hide them from people. Let's all have access to them. If we all have access to them, then it's fair. And if someone finds something they don't like, then it's up to them to not like it.
Exactly.
It's kind of
to get upset by it. Yeah. It's up to them not to get triggered by it.
Yeah, or just don't look.
It's like social media. Don't look at it.
Yeah, sometimes ignorance is bliss.
Exactly. Just don't just put it on hide. Don't even look at it. Yeah. Exactly. And I also find the conversation about using civil reconnaissance, like commercial reconnaissance, I guess, like companies like Planet, like that. I find the implications, and even Google Earth to an extent. I don't think Google Earth is or Google Maps. I don't think Google Maps or Google Earth is for that purpose, but people use it for that purpose, and it's free. But there are other companies that you can buy satellite imagery. You can buy it. To me, the implications of that are nuts, because a regular person can do that. It's not just the government. There's a lot of ethical implications with that. I could understand for planning, for maybe construction, having to have that, or if you're a lawyer, maybe having to have that, but maybe somebody like me who's just in a bad mood doesn't need it, or somebody who, is having a bad day does not need that. I don't know. That's just something I think about, that there's a lot of ethical implications to that. And maybe you don't need a picture of somebody scratching their, Dwayne is going to kill me for saying this. You don't need a picture of someone scratching their butt in their driveway. Maybe you don't need that, I don't know.
I have a Ring doorbell. And we're having some building work done, and I saw some of our builders scratching things they shouldn't be scratching.
Oh, jeez.
They everyone knows what a Ring doorbell is. So at the same point, I'm doing it in my own property. So who am I to say the countries can't do it? But it's pretty crazy, the technology that exists there these days for all of us.
It's kind of a brave new world out there. It really is that we have all this at our thing.
Yeah, and the ethical implications and ethics of all this is certainly something that perhaps we don't talk. In general, the population of the world aren't talking enough about. We are all surveilled, whether it's a Ring doorbell or whatever. We're all constantly under surveillance, and are we happy with it? Should we be under this much surveillance? And if we are, who should have access to that information? And should we all have it? Or should we not? So on and so forth.
Yeah, who needs access to that? Who deserves access to that above others?
Yeah,
exactly.
And who's qualified to answer that question is also implication behind that. There's one thing we haven't talked about. This is an episode about the military in space, and we've only really talked about surveillance. And of course, there are other aspects of military in space which we've not covered. Yes. We've only very briefly mentioned Space Force in name and about budget for it. Perhaps there's a whole other episode to talk about. Space forces and the idea of actual military in space, not just surveillance. And I feel like it's more of a discussion about the future, but yet the Space Force exists in the United States. So I think that's probably something we need to talk about at some point as well. But today it's mainly been about the history, which predominantly has been surveillance, right?
Exactly.
So for those of you who would like to watch the full interview with Dwayne and see Emily freak out at a wasp during the interview,
sorry.
Head over to patreon.com/space and things, where you can watch that video. And of course, in the show notes, there'll be information about Dwayne and his book.
New episodes every Thursday. Make sure you're subscribed on your podcast provider.
So, Emily, what's caught your eye in spaceflight this week?
Couple things. First of all, many of you have seen this week. A lot of our listeners all over the world have seen this week, is the insane solar activity, which has caused auroras in much of the northern or southern lights, depending on where your latitude is. there have been northern lights across much of the world this week, extending all the way down into Florida. I don't think that's happened here since 1859. I unfortunately did not get a good view of these because it was cloudy here. Dang it. But that's okay. I've seen a lot of marvelous photos and things like that. So that's definitely an interesting space event, astronomical event, I should say, that happened this week really unexpectedly. And unexpectedly for me, I don't really follow a lot of solar astronomy very much. I think in the future, we really need to get a guest on the show who knows a lot about that. I think that would be a cool subject to talk about the sun, how it affects Earth. That would probably be a cool show in the future. So a great website that I've been consulting for the last week or so is solarham.com. Really useful website, really, and also I would follow it on Facebook. Really awesome if you're trying to follow these activities. That is definitely something really cool that caught my eye this week. Another thing that caught my eye this week is that Rod Pyle, a guest on our show, a previous guest on our show, is going to be awarded with the National Space Society's Space Pioneer Award at the ISDC at the end of the month. I believe the ISDC is it's the International Space Development Conference. And it's being held in Los Angeles this year from May 23rd to 26th. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be attending this year only because I have some more things I'm doing this summer that I'm trying to save up money for. So I apologize for that. But very proud of Rod Pyle. That's awesome. Congratulations on this very well-deserved honor. So, Dave, what has caught your eye this week?
Yeah, congratulations, Rod. That's fantastic news. And those Aurora really were very special, weren't they? Unfortunately, I looked out my window and didn't see any, but everyone else seemed to. So maybe my eyes are playing up.
We had clouds.
Yeah, we didn't. I just didn't see it. It was the right time. Everything. I maybe it is my eyes.
Yeah.
And anyway, the story that there's a long article that's gone up written by Josh Dinner on space.com called How SpaceX's Private Polaris Dawn Astronauts Will Attempt the First Ever All-Civilian Spacewalk. We've covered this before, so this is an extension of the Inspiration 4 mission, which took place nearly 3 years ago now. Billionaire Jared Isaacman has hired SpaceX Dragon capsule for some private missions. The first one was Inspiration 4. The second one will be Polaris Dawn, and they're going to do the first EVA. And this week, we've seen their new SpaceX EVA suit, which looks very similar to the suit that anyone flies on SpaceX with, the futuristic looking spacesuit. Very cool. So that's amazing. They've been able to keep that aesthetic, and hopefully that all works out well. So this is a very in-depth article by Josh Dinner, which I recommend if you're interested in this.
Josh is amazing. He's a good guy.
It's a really great article. So I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it and learnt a lot. And we do intend on doing more about Polaris Dawn closer to that mission when we know the date.
Josh Dinner's article is very amazing. So go check it out.
Absolutely.
You're listening to the Space and Things podcast with Emily Carney and Dave Giles.
All right, that's all we have time for this week. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed your time we spent together and maybe learned something as well. If you're new here, why not check out our back catalogue? If you've enjoyed this episode, then I'm sure there are plenty others that you're going to love.
Thank you, as always, to our Patreon subscribers. We're always open for new people to join, so please check it out at patreon.com/spaceandthings. You get some free goodies and bonus content. Plus, you get to submit questions for our guest and be a part of the show in other ways, too. So go check it out. Anyway, we'll be back with more Space and Things next week. But until then, don't forget, in space, no one can hear you me.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Space and Things podcast with Emily Carney and Dave Giles.